Hi, how's it going? This is resident of Collingwood for YouTube, resident underslash Collingwood for bit shoot, and I'm here to continue my read along review for John Philip Betancourt's continuing blog series, The Return of Dark Shadows, Series 13, Chapter 5, Octogenarian? Okay. On a cool autumn late afternoon, the wind off the Atlantic Sea filled the trees that surrounded the great house on Widow's Hill. The first floor windows were all aglow with subtle burning yellow lights. As a black sedan with blacked out windows slowly made its way up the pebble driveway that ended in half a circle round a bubbling fountain outside the mansion's front door. A chauffeur dressed in all black jumped out of the front seat and rushed to the car's rear door, removed his cap just before he opened it. A dainty and perfect leg slowly swung out as the anchor for the tiny body of Carolyn Stoddard Thorne, fresh from the Bangor airport off her flight from her home in London. She was alone. Her husband Jack remained at home with their 9-month-old daughter Alexandra. Carolyn sighed as she looked up at the mansion's turret that reflected in her black sunglasses. The tower was the centerpiece of the mansion. The welcoming crown jewel that sat just over the front entrance. Carolyn removed her dark sunglasses and revealed her icy blue eyes that filled with emotion over her return. She was home. Against all her better judgment, she was home. But today was her mother Elizabeth's 80th birthday. She had to be here. As the chauffeur grabbed hold of Carolyn's luggage, she quickly ushered him into the house, which she still had a key to. This was her home, after all, a place where she lived most of her life, a place that held not only a family history, but a legacy of secrets, terrors, and horrors that filled her mind just as she pushed the door open and walked over the threshold and into the foyer with its familiar stonework walls, centuries-old tapestries, and iconic ebony statues with their freshly dusted marble stands. It smelled the same. She hadn't been in the mansion in years, since the 1980s, since her marriage, since the birth of her daughter, her second child. It was the smell of her family, of coffee and roses and soot from the giant fireplace in the drawing room. Carolyn, her bags now tucked away in a corner near the staircase, stood in the drawing room, staring up at the painting of her mother that had been placed there by David just to please Carolyn. It was gorgeous. It was a painted Elizabeth in her prime. It's not a Sam Evans, Carolyn joked to herself, remembering Collinsport's most famous local artist. But it'll do, won't it? David said, doorway of the drawing room. David, Carolyn said, her face lighting up at the sight of her grown-up cousin, now a handsome, strong man. They hugged so tight that she could feel his heartbeat. She missed him a lot. So tell me, how are things? Is mother ready for her party? Carolyn asked as the much taller David released her from his grasp. Well, you know how Aunt Elizabeth is. Really, she's not too keen on celebrating anything, but I've made sure she understands just how important her 80th birthday is. Most of our family didn't get to see this age. This is a big deal, David explained. Most of our family, huh? Most of our family reached 80 and beyond, and beyond. Carolyn joked, referring to everlasting life of some of their family members. We don't need to mention that when we go up there to see your mom in her bedroom or at the party, especially around Mrs. Johnson. You know how she gets, David worried to Carolyn's bad girl smirk. Oh, Mrs. Johnson, Carolyn said in a hearty laugh. She's coming? She asked, genuinely happy to hear the name of the family's longtime and retired housekeeper. She is. Kim had a chauffeur pick her up at the train station, so ready to go up and see your mom? Asked David, reaching for her hand to take her up to see Elizabeth. As I'll ever be. The two cousins, who had been through a world of nightmares throughout their lives, walked hand in hand through the foyer. Carolyn looked to her right and saw that Barnabas's painting was still placed in the corner by the front door. She took a gulp of air and looked away, as if it pained her to even give it a long glance. David walked her up the stairs and through the long hall. At first, Carolyn paused and tried to pull him in a different direction, down another hallway that led to where she remembered Elizabeth's room was. No, she's over here now, David corrected her. Carolyn was surprised. Elizabeth's current bedroom was down a private hallway that led to an atrium, a private sitting room that opened up into a large room that in Carolyn's time used to be the home's chapel. Just before they entered the chapel or Elizabeth's room, Carolyn whispered, "You put her in the chapel." David whispered back an explanation. She insisted in the change of rooms years ago. She likes it better in here. We don't use it as a chapel anymore, she said. She felt safer in here. As David opened the door to Elizabeth's room, Carolyn peeked in from around his broad shoulders. The room was dimly lit, almost purely by by candles. It still had many of the Gothic-style religious paintings that adorned the walls. It had been designed as a family chapel centuries ago, a place for the family to go to find solace, prayer, and meditation throughout the chaos of their lives. However, it was seldom used, for the exception for many visits by Abigail Collins in the 1800s. As they walked in, Elizabeth was sitting up in bed reading a book. Her eyes slowly turned upwards and saw her beautiful daughter standing before her. The family matriarch slowly turned her head and squinted her eyes, as if she did not believe what she was seeing. The child she loved more than anything in the world, a child that was now grown and beautiful, and a mother again herself, had returned to see her. "What is this?" Elizabeth said softly as she dropped the book down in her lap. "You're still in bed. Now that's not the mother I knew," Carolyn said with a sweet grin as she walked over and gave her mother a kiss on the cheek. "How are you, Mother?" "What is this?" Elizabeth asked again, staring deep into Carolyn's eyes. "It's a surprise, Aunt Elizabeth. Carolyn's come home. She's here to celebrate your birthday with us," David explained. "Surprise, Carolyn." Oh, Carolyn. Elizabeth's mind quickly caught up to who was in front of her, and reached out and held onto her daughter tightly, as if she didn't want to let her go, like a child who was presented with her favorite toy. She wanted to never part from Carolyn again. The warmth in her heart spread to all over her body. This was a surprise indeed. "Are you happy to see me, Mother?" "Yes, I am, darling. So happy. Oh, I've been waiting for you to come home for so long. I have so much to tell you, so much to explain to you, and so much I need for you to hear." "Oh, Carolyn, I'm so happy to see your face again," Elizabeth said with tears in her eyes. Well, 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 we'll have plenty of time to catch up," Carolyn replied. "No, I have to tell you something right now. It's as if you knew exactly when to come and see me. See, Elizabeth said as she reopened the book that she had on her lap. It wasn't just any book, it was a journal. A journal Elizabeth had been keeping for years. She was carefully reading over it as David and Carolyn entered to see her. I've been writing these. They're my dreams. I've been chronicling my dreams, Carolyn, and I need you to read them. Something is happening. Look, they're all connected. I've written these out, and the scenes in my dreams seem to be coming true. Look, read them, Carolyn, read them, Elizabeth said to Carolyn's disappointment. Mother, now, I didn't come here so that you could start with all this again. You know how it bothers me so. It's your birthday. Can't we go down into the screen room and enjoy some tea and just have a lovely evening? Carolyn said, already dreading what nightmares were written in that book. Aunt Liz, you never mentioned any dreams you were having, David said. I have them here in this book, Carolyn. Please read it. You must protect this. I feel that icy cold feeling, you know what I mean, don't you? You remember that feeling you used to feel? It too. You did. You would always tell me it was like the sea, the ice cold breath of the sea. Well, I feel it now, and I've written about it in these pages. Death. It's death, Carolyn, Elizabeth said, holding on to Carolyn's hand tightly. Carolyn was getting upset. She didn't want to come home and see her mother in this state. A state of fright, terrorized by her own mind and dreams that she could not control. This was exactly the type of situation Carolyn wanted to avoid, and was safe from when she was in London. The family curse of madness and darkness, it was clearly still alive and well within the walls of Collinwood. Carolyn, sitting on Elizabeth's bed, took the book and looked over at David as if to show him she needed help. All right, Aunt Liz, we'll read over the book and see what we can do about it, okay? I'll call in Noelle so that she can get you ready for your evening walk before your birthday dinner, David said. Yes, Noelle, yes, okay, but please read it, Liz said in a voice that seemed to be fading. Carolyn and David walked together to the bedroom door. She grabbed his arm and pulled him around so that they were facing each other. Who is Noelle? Carolyn demanded to know. Noelle, David repeated in a tone of voice sounding like he couldn't believe she didn't remember. He then saw Carolyn's eyes filling with panic over the name that meant much more to her than she was leading on. You remember her, don't you? She's Beau's sister? Carolyn, of course, remembered Noelle, and especially Beau. Noelle and Carolyn went to school together in 1966. Carolyn dated Beau and even became pregnant with his son, which she gave up for adoption in Europe, the same child that Noelle secretly adopted and raised, the same child who lived and grew up at the old house for years. Why did you hire her? Why wasn't I told about that? Carolyn said angrily. David didn't know what to tell her. The truth of what he decided to hire Noelle when she came in for an interview years ago for the caretaker job was not going to come out of his lips. On the day in 1985, Noelle came in to interview for the job. She introduced herself. She even mentioned that she and her brother, whom she stated had gone missing years before, were friends with Carolyn. David knew who Beau was. He remembered Beau. He remembered that Beau investigating the disappearance of Arabella Stoddard in 1966. Into the mansion late one night, David Then 10 found him, shot him, and killed him. Bo was dead. David knew it. Noel suspected it. Not David, but Bo being dead. I'll clarify that for a second. David's private guilt for murdering Noel's brother in cold blood when he was just 10, and his father, Roger, hiding the body somewhere within the catacombs of Collinwood, aided him over his lifetime, and hiring Noel seemed like the only way he could make it up for it, at least secretly. She needed work. She's very good with your mother, I promise you. If I thought anything bad would happen in Noel's care, I wouldn't even have hired her, David assured. You're lying, his cousin muttered. I can tell when you're lying. I can always tell when what happened. Why is she here? David was clearly hiding something. Carolyn felt it in her bones. He began to sweat and squirm in front of her, as if the heat of 10,000 suns were baking his skin. He began before Noel walked into the atrium that attached to Elizabeth's bedroom. The three suddenly all met eyes uncomfortably. Silence followed, but Carolyn was quick to call the cold feelings. Noel, honey, it's so good to see you again. David was just explaining to me how wonderful you have been to my mother over the years. How can I ever thank you, Carolyn said awkwardly. Noel smirked. The woman that gave her nephew up her nephew. Noel smirked. The woman that gave up her nephew at birth was home. She could see Cameron's eyes in his mother's. There was a strange resemblance that she stupidly had not expected. But there it was, her beloved nephew's eyes, looking out from his mother's face. Welcome home, Carolyn, Noel said coldly. I'm going to get Mrs. Stoddard ready for our walk. Is that okay? Of course, David said, allowing Noel to enter the bedroom. As the door closed, Carolyn was clearly frustrated with the choices David had made. While she was away from Colin's port, but now it was out of her hands. She pulled the book from David's hand, the Journal of Elizabeth's Dreams. She huffed in annoyance with her cousin, whom she could tell was hiding something, and rolled her eyes at him. She opened a black leather-bound book of dreams and skimmed through the pages. One page, dated the night before, struck out to Carolyn. Over and over, in repeating, writing in the same style of writing, line after line, for 2 whole pages read, Dead Vic, Dead Vic, Dead Vic, Dead Vic. Carolyn paused. It was strange. She turned it around and showed David. Vic, David read. Vicky, he added in a hushed and worried voice. Carolyn took one more look at the open book. She then quickly shut it and turned towards the dim lamp sitting in the corner of the atrium. The orange light reflected on her aged and yet perfect face, like the light of the setting sun just outside the walls of the great mansion. This is what I was afraid of. This is what she was worried about when returning home after 15 years away. God, Carolyn replied. What are we in for now? The orange light from the sun and filtered through a shell of purple clouds above the village came down on the land of Collinwood. Evangeline, the witch and daughter of the legendary Barnabas, and Angelique, and who had been posing as a governess to David Collins' 5-year-old son, Caleb, and Caleb himself were returning to the mansion from a small walk through the large ivy hedge garden on the grounds of Collinwood. The wind was picking up, and as the cold of the autumn breeze kissed and caressed their skin, A secret set of eyes lurked in the shadows of the trees just beyond the garden and away from Evangeline's view. Evangeline, the governess, who was given the name Claudia by the nuns Barnabas left her with, and raised her back in time, knelt down to adjust the scarf around the little boy's neck that had slipped and unraveled while on their walk. As she did, she could feel cold eyes, deep, dark, cold eyes. She knew she was being watched. She stood up and looked towards the shadowy forest in the distance. She could feel the eyes staring at her now. Its gaze was growing more and more intense as a wild animal in the woods howled a blood-curdling moan. She grabbed onto Caleb's hand and tightened her grip. The wind picked up and flicked her beautiful golden hair curls as she turned to face the wind. She saw in the distance the old house. The old house, the symbol of her father. The father she wanted revenge over. The father, Barnabas, who took her from her birth in 1971 and traveled back in time and abandoned her in an orphanage with nuns. Was it him? Was it his eyes she could feel staring at her from the beyond? Was it his deathly cold gaze, finally returning home to reunite with the daughter he abandoned and whose mother he killed after so many years of battling her? Can we go home now? I'm cold, little Caleb said, pulling at her tail of the governess's coat. Of course, Evangeline said, suddenly snapping out of her own dazed moment from the cold wind and sense the sense of the eyes. But they were not alone. The pair of cold eyes in the shadows had not left them, and were still staring, and suddenly the shadow connected to the eyes leaped out from its encasement, withering the shade of the trees around them, and grabbed hold of Evangeline. It was like every shadow around them came alive and spouted arms and a head and two eyes. It was just as powerful of the vampire. It was the power of the vampire. It was the power of Justin Patterson. He knew it could not attack his new enemy, the witch, Evangeline, with his own body. He had to send out his own soul, his darkened shadow, and attack her, take her, and bring her to his lair in the old house. Justin's black-hearted shadow separated Evangeline's hand from Caleb and surrounded her whole body to the point where she felt like she was now inside of a black space, but a black space that was transparent and that she could see out of but not escape. She put her hands up against the black mist like walls that were dragging her away and pounded on it as if she were breaking down a door. But the mist was impenetrable. Justin made it so. Evangeline tried to scream, but her voice was silenced. As she was taken away, she could see little Caleb standing alone in the middle of the yard. His eyes were like giant white saucers, staring out in shock of what had happened to his nanny in front of his very own eyes. As the wind continues to blow and pulled at Caleb's scarf again, the blob of shadows that Justin sent to get Evangeline dragged her way into the woods that surrounded the old house. Caleb stood there alone in the cold, unsure of what to do next. Evangeline and Caleb were not the only two out to absorb the fresh air. Before nightfall, Noel and Elizabeth, too, had been walking the land around the main mansion. As mistress and caretaker made their final lap around a long cement sidewalk, they went the circumference of Collinwood and dipped into an evergreen ivy hedge, where they'd minter among the large limestone statues of various Greek and Roman goddesses. As Noel slowly chugged along Elizabeth like a tugboat in the bay pulling away a large freight ship arm in arm, the little boy stood dead center of the garden where his governess had left him. Liz, dressed in a long black dress with long sleeves that went down to the back of her and looped around her middle finger with a fine satin ribbon, blinked hard trying to make sense of what it was she was seeing in front of her. A boy, Liz said softly to her caretaker. Noelle, who looked up from her mistress, who was pointing out onto the oncoming fog. Noelle tilted her head, confused. Is it Caleb? Caleb, she shouted. The little boy, who had his back turned to the woman, quickly turned and, at hearing his name, and beeline towards his great aunt Elizabeth. His scarf blew in the wind, and then untangled from around his neck and fell to the moist lawn below his feet. What are you doing out here alone? It's getting dark. Noelle scolded. Where's Vanjie? She added, using Caleb's nickname of Vanjie for Evangeline, his missing governess. Vanjie went with them. She's gone, the shaken boy said. Elizabeth removed the long, oversized black shawl that was wrapped around her neck and shadows and placed it maternally around the little boy's body to warm him, then ran her perfectly aged hands up and down the little arms. Who did she go with? Elizabeth asked as she looked deep into Caleb's eyes, her voice soft and worried. Caleb, a boy of 5, couldn't articulate what he'd seen. All he knew was that he saw eyes, blackness, and something come from the shadows from the direction of the old house. And take Evangeline. It was coming, and it got her, and she tried to come back to me, but it took her, Aunt Liz. It just took her away, and I was scared, and I could not move. It took her away. I stayed to wait for her. The little boy said, his eyes filling with tears. A person? Liz asked. A person, the boy said. I think a person, yes. What did the person look like? Noel asked. Which way did they go? Caleb's body stiffened. His facial expression turned cold. As cold as the wind blowing through their hair. And then the shawl and the black skirt of Elizabeth's dress. He slowly made an about face and lifted his finger in the direction of the black mass of shadows that engulfed Evangeline and pointed. There, he replied simply, with his finger stretched out to the old house. Noel and Elizabeth followed his finger with their eyes, and both had a visceral reaction to what they saw. The grand glaring imaging of the top of the old house, colonnade peering over the tops of the trees in the distance beyond the hedge garden. To Elizabeth, that house, the description of the shadows and darkness, only meant one person to her. The matriarch of the family. It meant Barnabas. It would always mean Barnabas. It would forever mean Barnabas. She covered her mouth and gasped and thought of all the people that man took and killed for good or for bad, for his future and for theirs. It was a scar, a deep wound on her heart and soul. Could it be? Could it be? She said under her breath as the last kiss of sunlight twinkled in their giant canary diamond ring, canary ring around her finger. But Noelle knew better. She knew that there was something lurking at the old house, something just as dangerous and hungry as Barnabas Collins once was. Elizabeth's fears were not misjudging the situation, just misplaced on who she should really fear. Not the man from her past, but a man that was in her present and living with her own caretaker. Mrs. Stoddard, do you think you can make it inside with Caleb on your own so that I check and see what's out there? Noelle asked, knowing she could handle Justin in whatever form she found him in. Absolutely not. You can't go out there on your own. I forbid it. It's too dangerous, Noelle. Liz replied, pulling Caleb into her body, holding him tightly for warmth. I'll be all right, I promise, Noelle replied, handing Liz her cane. Now please go back inside and I'll take care of it. I'll take care of everything. Elizabeth looked at her caretaker sideways. It was an odd way of saying things, but she pulled on Caleb's hand and began the short walk back into the mansion. And as the two fell into the thick fog and vanished, Noelle turned to the old house. What in hell have you done now, Justin? She said to herself. What in the hell have you done? As the evening progressed, an army of caterers and florists filled the mansion's dining room, setting up for Elizabeth's birthday party. There were 3 giant golden canterburies in the center of the long table that extended almost from wall to wall, filtering and glowing light that it reflected off the golden wall paper of the dining room. Each china plate a family heirloom that had been passed down from generation to generation, and would one day be Carolyn's, who was sitting next to the head of the table, where her mother would be seated. Kimberly entered the room in a beautiful golden dress with a large white flower at her shoulder, arm in arm with a special guest. The guest, a small framed woman with white hair and wrinkly skin that she wore with a badge of honor, smirked an engrossing grin that lit up the dining room just as bright as the Canterbury's. Mrs. Johnson, Carolyn yelped as she quickly rushed over to the mansion's former housekeeper. Oh my, what a welcome, Mrs. Johnson replied. You look sensational, David said as he too entered the room. Still full of tall tales, huh, David? Some things never change, the old maid winked. What is all this? Mrs. Johnson asked, looking over at the table full of food. Oh, we had it catered. Is there something else you might like? Kimberly asked. I come all the way from Boston. I could eat a horse. Whatever it is, it's better than what I had on that train, Mrs. Johnson said as she swished over the table to take her seat. As Carolyn, David, and Kimberly were making small talk with Mrs. Johnson, Elizabeth entered with Caleb from their separate but equally strange walks outdoors. Happy birthday, the guests and younger Collins family members exclaimed as Elizabeth and the boy walked in. Elizabeth, her face concerned about what Caleb had said to her, and Noelle outside only gave a slight smile and pointed in the direction of Caleb's seat next to his father. The boy evidently follows her directions and quickly sat next to David. Where's Noelle? David asked. She had to rush off to the old house, Elizabeth replied with a lifted brow. And Evangeline? Kim asked as she helped little Caleb into his booster seat so that his bright little face could see over the large table at the rest of the family. Ghost took her, Caleb said as he reached for a dinner roll. Ghost? What is he talking about? Carolyn asked. Ghost took her, Caleb repeated. Took her away. Ha! You see? Some things never change, Mrs. Johnson giggled as she nibbled on a corner of bread. Oh, Mrs. Johnson, Elizabeth shouted, suddenly noticing her old housekeeper. My goodness, it's been so long. You came, you actually came. You said you'd never come to Collinsport again after Roger died. Liz says as she turned she noticed a guest she hadn't seen in decades. You're right, some things never change, Liz added. But they should. Roger's death was the last Collins funeral I wanted to see. You all make a note of that, Mrs. Johnson said as David looked down at his plate thinking of his late father's death. We all miss Uncle Roger, Carolyn said of her uncle who died in 1988 of a heart attack in his sleep. She then looked over at David and grabbed his hand and squeezed. They were cousins, but at the same time their older age had become best friends, not to Kim's amusement. I come all the way from Boston and realize Collinsport hasn't seen the sun in months. Looking around, the clouds have covered this place like a blanket in the winter time. It's no wonder Ghost took this new governess. That's what happens here. Governess just seemed to vanish, Mrs. Johnson said as she raised her wine glass. The ghost her. Ate her up, Caleb replied. Mother, what is Caleb talking about? Carolyn asked again. Elizabeth wasn't sure to answer. The little boy had mentioned to her the whole way back and to the house from outside about the dark blob, the ghostly spirit that came and took Evangeline right in front of his eyes. The dark spirit that Justin sent. Justin the vampire secretly living at the old house that Noelle had been hiding since 1966. I don't quite know what happened, but she's gone. She's vanished into thin air. I knew this would happen. I dreamt these things. I've been dreaming these things for years and years, Liz said as the ghostly candlelit reflected in her 80-year-old eyes. I think he's returned, she added. Two caterers off to the side looked at each other, confused, worried even. They were locals. They knew the stories. They could only imagine who the he was. Mother, don't, Carolyn warned. You can feel him too, can't you? You can feel it just like I can. It's in your blood. It's how we have always been. When he returns, we feel like the birds. Feel the winter coming and migrate on, except Elizabeth said just bore she paused to stare at the light of the flickering candlelight. The light danced in Elizabeth's gray eyes like two little suns as she thought, the he in her mind, the he that brought her so much terror, her dreams for years and years, Barnabas. You're the only one left. Those birds, Carolyn, left us all behind, Elizabeth finished. Mother, Carolyn began trying to get back on track about the missing nanny. Where did you last see Evangeline? The ghost took her, Caleb shouted again. Elizabeth looked over at him and smirked as if to say, listen to the boy. This is ridiculous, Kimberly suddenly broken in. There are no ghosts. Ha! Mrs. Johnson blurted out as they all looked over at her. David shook his head and slammed down his glass, making a loud bang on the loud oak wood. Enough! He shouted. How could Evangeline just up and leave like this, without us knowing, or even telling us that she wanted to go? This makes no sense, David said in a dissenting tone. I mean, he's 5 years old. What does he know of ghosts? It only took you 5 more years to recognize what you had always seen all your life, David. Perhaps your boy is quicker, Elizabeth shot back, reminiscing on David's own childhood, experiencing with the ghost of Collinwood. Experience with the ghost. Aunt Liz, David said outside, showing shock at her wicked sense of humor, but inside actually loving every minute of it. I don't want to hear any more of this, Carolyn insisted, her fury over ghost talk showing all over her face as the soup was being served. Evangeline maybe decided to take a nap. Maybe she's upstairs and no one went to check on her, she added. She was outside with Caleb on a walk, Kim added to the conversation, her heart beating a mile a minute. She's not gone, Carolyn insisted. She went away. She went away, Caleb insisted, finally getting a hold of the dinner roll and breaking it in half to dunk it into the soup. Caleb, Kim shouted. Let him speak. He's speaking the truth, Noel. And I saw him alone in the hedge garden. Evangeline wouldn't have left him that way if she wasn't taken, Liz said, sipping her own glob of soup and winking at the boy. Then we should call the police. If she's really been taken right off the grounds of our house, then we have to call the police, David insisted, unsure why everyone was seeming to be so calm. Police have never been able to find anyone who has ever gone missing off the grounds of Collinwood, David. You know that better than anyone else here. She's gone. Something took her, Caleb saw. Whatever Caleb saw won't be found by the police, Elizabeth added. All right, I don't want to hear any more. There is an obvious explanation about why Evangeline is gone, and I don't want to hear any more about this ghost talk. You all probably scared her off. I mean, ghost. And whatever else, this house isn't exactly a place that breeds bright and cheering. And with you lot always talking about God knows what, I'm sure she just had enough, Carolyn replied, silencing the entire table. No one knew what to do. They all knew the truth. That Liz perhaps was correct. They had all seen it before, the vanishes, the disappearances, the quick coming and going. Sometimes they'd come back, sometimes they wouldn't. But the one thing was sure, the Collinsport police could never solve these things, even though they tried. The next course in the birthday dinner was now seen served in an awkward silence. Carolyn could tell there was a bit of strain. She's going to come back, Carolyn suddenly said as everyone looked up at their plate. She wasn't if she wants to get paid. Later that night, after one of the most bizarre dinners the family have ever experienced, Mrs. Johnson had been taken back to her sister's home in Boston by one of the chauffeurs. She had been offered a room in the mansion for the night, but true to form, she was happy to deny the room. She'd rather drive 3 hours south home than stay one more night in that house. For her part, Carolyn sat in her old bedroom, staring at herself in the mirror. As she brushed her hair, she thought about what Caleb had said. She brushed her hair. She thought about what her mother had said. Could it be him? Could the monster, the deep, dark, secret boogeyman of her family, really have returned and taken the new governess? She stared into the mirror and at her own reflection. Her gaze was tight, her eyes fixated on her own face. Suddenly the mirror cracked and knocked Carolyn out of her trance as tears of terror fell from her eyes. She knew her mother was right. There was something afoot. There was a power, an energy. It was there. It was alive. It was awake. But Barnabas, it was not. The family just didn't know it yet. Kimberly crept out of the bedroom after putting him to asleep with no sign of Evangeline. She peeked back into his room and watched the little spinning nightlight lantern shooting a nautical on the walls of the boy's room of ships and sea creatures. He was fast asleep. He was very typical of a Collins child. He had witnessed a terrible event just hours before, but somehow he felt fine. enough to knock out and sleep without any fear. The natural ability of any Collins family member to be able to lock away their fears of things that would bump into the night in the night, sorry, and carry with their lives was almost like a fragment of DNA that was passed down from generation to generation. Kimberly, however, did not have this trait. She was scared out of her mind. David's cheating wife quickly left her son's doorway and rushed down the hall and past the governess's quarters where Evangeline had been sleeping. It was empty as she passed and turned the corner of the hallway and flew down the main stairwell and scurried over to the phone that was in the foyer on a large cherry wood table. She looked around. The probable coast was clear. There was no one in the drawing room, no one in the adjoining study. She quickly picked up the phone and dialed her lover Victor's house. "What is it?" Victor said as he quickly answered her phone just one ring. "The governess is missing," Kimberly said in a hushed voice. "She's just gone. No one knows where she went. All of her things are still here, Victor. She just vanished. Caleb was out with her, and he says Ghost took her. Ghost!" Victor had been waiting for this. He knew at some point something strange would happen that would bring him into the fold and start the process he had been urging Kim to help him with. To Victor, Evangeline was just another victim of this evil family's connection with the darkness of the other side. It was the sole purpose of the OTH. "So what does this tell you, huh? I told you it's time to start this. The counselor of our organization words has had words with me how we are late to the game and we need to start this process, Kimberly, with Carolyn. We need to take them out, all of them. Do you hear me?" Sorry. "We have to take them out," Victor said. "But what do I do?" Kim said, her brainwashing secretly in place. "Kill them. Start it. Kill them all. I'll help. I'll help you with all this. Evangeline's life is gone. I know it. They're responsible. Who else would have summoned things from the depths of hell to take her?" "Who?" Victor said, continuing his cold brainwashing of the woman who was pregnant with his child. Okay, I'll do it. I'll do it. With your help," Kimberly said as Victor smiled an evil grin on the other side. "Good girl. We'll start tomorrow once I tell Counselor Devil." And Kimberly did not reply. She hung up the phone and looked around again. No one was in the foyer with her. Just the dark corners of the room and the sleepy eyes of the painting of the wall. In the shadows of the landing just above the staircase was Carolyn, freshly startled from her shattered mirror. Unlike little Caleb, Carolyn couldn't sleep, and as she stood in a wide awake silence above the staircase, listening to Kim's conversation, she learned enough to realize her cousin David's wife was not exactly who she would pretended to be. Alright, that's the read along, guys. Oh, obstruction. Give me a second. Alright. So everybody, when you have Elizabeth, Carolyn, they think it's Barnabas. And I think David deep down does too. They don't know about Justin Patterson, and they absolutely should not. Hell, most people think Justin Patterson is dead, and after he went missing, but they don't know he got turned into a vampire. So, and the old house, it is synonymous with Barnabas. There's so many good references to Barnabas here with the old house. Any Dark Shadows fan knows the old house is synonymous with Barnabas. So it's not hard for the characters to get conflicted about who it is. That you could tell them it's Joe Schmo down the street. They'll be like, hell no, it's Barnabas Collins. Um, really great scene setting. Obviously, the character interaction was amazing. I mean, I'm not surprised, but just everybody at once, and then even separately, just every little piece. So really, really great job. I'm sorry this is a little later in the week. I just got crazy busy. So the normal read along reviews will return Monday. You guys have a great day. Link will be in the description box. I'll see you later.